some of you know me as I was coming in, people from other cruises. That's so cool, to meet people from other cruises. So I'll give you a little bit of brief history. I'm from Washington, D.C. When I was young and I had a lot more hair, I did think that I wanted to be a performer, and my parents gave me this wonderful life learning lesson. I live in Washington, D.C., grew up there. When I was 18 years old, we had a circuit of theaters that was owned by Barbara Walters' then husband, and it was called Music Fairs. Are any of you from the East, Northeast? Remember, like, Westbury Music Fair, which still exists, and there were some others. Well, I was graduating high school, 18 years old. I go to the audition, and wouldn't you know, they send me to New York for the callback. And I'm there, and the way it works is there's a director and a bunch of people at a table, and there's a circle of 60 or 70 men, and everybody gets to sing the best 16 bars they can sing. And, I'm starting around the circle, and you go, and we get to me. But before me, I got to see old men cry. They were at least 27 or 28. And, that was after thank you, no thank you, you wait over there, thank you, no thank you. And I saw what it meant to get a job. And I decided at 18 I'd rather go to college, which I did. I went to Michigan State, if there's any Spartans in the room. And I did perform when I was young, but I decided it wasn't the way I really wanted to eat. And, and I did a lot of other things. I had a consulting practice for 25 years in the real estate industry internationally, but musical theater has always been my passion. And 5 years ago, I put some things together, and when the cruise ships decided, yeah, we'll give you a shot, I've been on Celebrity often ever since, and I travel the world about 6 or 7 times a year lecturing on musical theater, in addition to the teaching I do at several adult learning facilities and colleges in the Washington, D.C. area, one of which is Johns Hopkins, so I'm very proud of that. So I hope we have fun together learning. I have my opinions. You don't have to like my opinions, but that's okay. And we're going to talk today, we're going to start with the 1940s, because in the 1940s, just about everything about the Broadway musical changed. I try to find pictures of Times Square in the beginning of each era. This is 1940, and there's nothing in this picture that exists today anymore at all, including the Planters Peanut sign. So when you get to Times Square next Sunday, nothing looks like this. But the big deal at the time was this woman by the name of Ethel Merman. Anybody never hear of Ethel Merman? She had become, by this point in time, the major Broadway personality. And one of the reasons was, if Ethel was singing in a theater, you could hear her 6 blocks away in the balcony of another theater. And you have to remember, these musicals were not amplified at all, so you had to really be able to sing over the orchestra, which was really pretty significant. Some other major stars at the time, one I think you may remember for sure in the upper left is Mary Martin. Below her is the singer Ethel Waters. She was a Cotton Club phenomenon. Irving Berlin loved her. And to be a black woman in a Broadway musical in 1940 was a very challenging place to try to have a career. And the woman in the upper right is almost totally forgotten. Her name is Vivian Siegel, and she was Rodgers and Hart's go-to leading lady for about 7 or 8 years. We had composers in the 1940s who were all pretty important. In the upper right is Kurt Weill. Now, Kurt Weill had fled the Nazis with his wife, Lotte Lenya. They had an interesting relationship, but he was composing very serious work. The next pair that you see to the left of him is Rodgers and Hart. Then you have Lerner and Lowe. Below them to the right is Irving Berlin. And then you have Cole Porter. Now, you'll notice there's a couple people missing, and that's because they hadn't started writing together yet. So don't worry, they will come up. Oh, there they are up at the top, Rodgers and Hammerstein. So remember I told you Ethel Merman was the kingpin of the Broadway musical, and Cole Porter now had taken Ethel Merman over, and he wrote all kinds of musicals for Ethel Merman. One of them, which I'll tell you, well, Panama Hattie was a story about this brassy broad, Ethel Merman's personality type, who lived in the Canal Zone and had a bar, and she falls in love with a wealthy young guy from Philadelphia, and the whole plot is, will his mother like her? The second plot musical up there, Something for the Boys. Now, I know all of you have seen this one about 100 times. It's about a Rosie Riveter kind of a person. After the war had broken out, she worked in an airplane factory. And in this airplane factory, she gets a letter delivered to her one day that tells her that she has inherited her uncle's farm near an army base somewhere in the South. And on this army base are all kinds of professional musicians who have been drafted, and she falls asleep one night and starts singing in a sleepwalk kind of a dream because her fillings conducted radio waves. Now, let's not all rush to the revival of that one. But the first changes of the 1940s, now, if there's anybody here who gets offended by more than PG material, we're going to talk about all of the musicals of the 1940s were truly about sex. And I bet no one ever thought about that before. The very first musical that has that as a theme is one that was called Lady in the Dark, and that is Gertrude Lawrence. Gertrude Lawrence, we owe a tremendous debt, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Gertrude Lawrence was a British actress. She was a great friend of Noel Coward's. She did a lot of his comedies. She introduced the song Someone to Watch Over Me in 1927 in a musical that the Gershwins wrote called OK. And she is now in New York City performing in this musical Lady in the Dark about a magazine editor, a major fashion magazine editor, and she cannot make up her mind what should go on the cover of the fall fashion magazine. Why can't she make up her mind? She's having an affair with not one, not two, but three men all at the same time. Now, this was 1940. One of the men was married. One of the men was on the West Coast, a movie producer, and then I think the other was her boss. This was all very, very sophisticated stuff for 1940, and what she does is she goes to see a psychiatrist who fixes her problems in 2 weeks. Now, we all know that's not exactly possible today, but the stories were told in dream sequences, and one of the sequences features a young actor who sings a song at lickety-split speed of Russian names, and his name was Danny Kaye. That's where he launches his career. The next musical that is truly all about sex is Pal Joey. This is the story of a young nightclub singer who, a hoofer rather, based upon some John O'Hara stories, and he is romancing lots of women all at the same time. In addition to this romancing of these younger women, he meets an older woman at his saloon where he works who starts flirting with him. She's about 15 years older than he. She's very interesting to him, and she's very married. And she rents an apartment for the two of them, and she agrees to take on a nightclub if, in fact, for him, he gives up all of these younger women. Well, Pal Joey had an interesting problem. That is Gene Kelly, by the way, his only leading role on Broadway. But there was a song in Pal Joey that was considered indecent. The lyrics went, I couldn't sleep and wouldn't sleep until I could sleep where I shouldn't sleep. Bewitched, bothered, and bewildered am I. I'll sing to him each spring to him and worship the trousers that cling to him. Bewitched, bothered, and bewildered am I. Then there's a lyric that goes, horizontally speaking, he's at his very best. I'm vexed again, perplexed again. Thank God I can't be oversexed again. Well, this was 1940. Oh, thank you. So this is 1940. And Ella Fitzgerald has recorded this particular song. The radio stations refuse to play it because it's considered too indecent. So they then have to go back, Rodgers and Hart, and rewrite the lyrics. And if you know this Ella Fitzgerald recording, what you will find is that you hear all of the PG lyrics first, then there's a musical segue, and you get all the racy X-rated stuff. So 13 years later, Pal Joey is revived for the first time by Julie Stein, the composer, and it runs for like 2.5 years on Broadway, and it's made into a movie with Kim Novak, Rita Hayworth, and Frank Sinatra. It's somewhat sanitized, but there is a scene where Rita Hayworth is rolling around in bed in the morning in a negligee, singing Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, and these lyrics were considered still, in 1957, in a movie, far too racy to actually appear in the movie. But, you know, there was a lot of famous music from Pal Joey, and one of the songs happens to be this one that Frank Sinatra and almost any male singer, Tony Bennett, Vic Damone, everybody sang this. And this was this lead character Joey's pickup song. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I never learned to spell, at least not well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I never learned to count a great amount. But my busy mind is burning to use what learning I've got. I won't waste any time. I'll strike while the iron is hot. If they ask me, I could write a book about the way you walk and whisper and look. I could write a preface on how we met, so the world would never forget. And the simple secret of the plot is just to tell them that I love you a lot. Then the world discovers, as our book ends, how to make two lovers of friends. Thank you. So, hold on one second. I just have to find something. I don't know why I'm not finding it. So, after Pal Joey, there's a couple other things that are trying to create change. One was called Cabin in the Sky, about the devil fighting over the soul of a man with God after he's killed in a knife fight. And we then get to the major game changer of the 1940s. Now, what did I tell you all most of the musicals of the 1940s were about? Right. Has anybody not ever seen Oklahoma? Oh, good. You've never seen Oklahoma? Oh, okay. So let's talk about this. Oklahoma is the story of coming of age on the prairie. Now, what we lose track of, if you know the movie, Shirley Jones and Gordon MacRae don't exactly look 17, 18, or 19, but that's how old these leading characters are. So keep that in mind. The Theater Guild, who used to produce plays and sold subscriptions, had this antique, terrible play from the early 1930s called Green Grow the Lilacs. It had some sexual overtones, and they sent it to Rodgers and Hart. Now, Larry Hart was a mess at this point in life. He was a severe alcoholic, terribly depressed. He was short, ugly, bald, and Jewish, none of which worked for him in 1940. Then Larry Hart looks at this and says, I'm way too sophisticated to write music, words for people who live on the prairie. I'm not interested. So the next thing the Theater Guild does is send it to Oscar Hammerstein and Jerome Kern. And Jerome Kern says, I'm way too sophisticated to be writing music about people who live on the prairie. So what happens next is the Theater Guild sends it to Rodgers and Hammerstein and says, why don't the two of you talk and see if you can't pull this together? And we all know what happens, they do, but they imagine something very unusual that they want to create. They want to create something that is called a musical play. They want to have the dialogue come right out of what the character is talking about, and they wish it to be very, very different than what's going on in the typical Broadway play at the time, where you have tap dancing and all kinds of songs that are typically not really related to the storytelling. So Oklahoma becomes very different, and a lot of things changed. Before Oklahoma, any song would do. You could have a star turn. Opening numbers didn't have to really now open a show. Dance could be used to tell story components. The concept of a musical play was born, and you could have a very dark character. So Rodgers and Hammerstein start to write based upon, well, let me hold on. Go back, Steve, go back. Okay. The idea was, you could have dark characters, you could have characters who do other things, and you could have strong women characters. And what they liked to do was create a style. They had a primary couple, which we call the A couple, a secondary couple that we call the B couple. They usually had a matriarchal figure. They wanted to talk about racism and classism, and they also wanted to have some sort of comic relief. All of that happens, oh, and they had to have a bad guy. Judd Fry is the bad guy. And in the simple exposition of Oklahoma, you could say the whole story is about a girl who wants to go to a picnic. I mean, that's sort of what's there, you know. But what it's really about is coming of age and learning. And it was set in Oklahoma because Oklahoma was maturing into the ability to become part of the United States as a full-fledged state. So it became the metaphor of coming of age. So we have Laurie, and I always wondered, if you're an actress, what do you have to know, to get in character? How did Laurie end up with her aunt? Well, there's a lot of clues. There's a song, Many a New Day, where Laurie sings, about how she's never going to be taken advantage of a man, and if a man dumps her and leaves her alone, she'll wash her hair, go buy a new dress, find her something new to wear, and start all over again. So my envisionment is her father jilted her mother somewhere along the line, fled. The mother was totally devastated. They go to live with her aunt and uncle. The uncle dies, and it's now these women on the prairie, and Laurie's mother dies of something or other. Maybe the Indians got her, I don't know. But in any event, that's sort of how I have to picture this. So Laurie is growing up to be this very determined, independent woman with a woman on the prairie. Now imagine what that must have been like running a farm in 1911. They needed a ranch hand, so they hired this guy who has sort of a weird, sketchy past. And in the meantime, there's this young cowboy who truly is infatuated with Laurie. Now where's the classism start to play out? There's a song in Oklahoma, why can't the farmers and the cowmen be friends? Because the cowmen didn't own anything. The farmers owned the land, and the cowmen were just coming and going, and they were not the most respected part of society at that point in time. But Oklahoma was very different in that when it opens, you have something that goes like this. The curtain is coming up, and you have a woman sitting on a front stoop churning butter. Now, there's no chorus of dancing girls around here or anything like that, but you see the scene coming alive. And she's just sitting there looking out at the audience, and the audience, this was very startling for 1943. And then off stage, you start to hear this as he makes his entrance. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. The corn is as high as an elephant's eye, and it looks like it's climbing clear up to the sky. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way. are standing like statues. All the cattle are standing like statues. They don't turn their heads as they see me ride by. But a little brown maverick is winking her eye. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way. All the sounds of the earth are like music. All the sounds of the earth are like music. The breeze is so busy it don't miss a tree. And the old weeping willow is laughing at me. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way. Oh, what a beautiful day. Thank you all. So, this is something else that changed because of Oklahoma. There was this guy, Jack Kapp, from Decca Records, and he decided, why don't we record these songs from these musicals and people can buy them in albums and take them home. And this becomes the beginning of what we now treasure, the original cast Broadway recordings. After Oklahoma, Rodgers and Hammerstein thought it would be, we were talking about sex. Do you remember Adu Annie in she sings a song that goes like this: I'm just a girl who can't say no. And then she has another lyric in another song that says, those the stories about my bloomers, rumors. And then you have, of course, Judd Fry, who's a sexual deviant, collects pornography. So the sexual overtones truly carry out through Oklahoma. Rodgers goes his way, Hammerstein goes his way, and takes the music of Bizet, resets it into a South Carolina cigarette factory, calls it Carmen Jones, the next musical of the time. But the next groundbreaking musical of the era was a musical called On the Town. Now, if you wonder how some of these things, I have to take a water break, hold on. If you wonder how some of these things come about, Leonard Bernstein had graduated from Harvard. He moves to New York, and he's trying to begin a career, and he becomes a song transposer or a music transposer, and he gets a part-time job working for the New York Philharmonic. He has a roommate. The roommate's name is Adolph Green. Adolph Green writes stand-up comedy with a woman, her name being Betty Cohen, which becomes Betty Comden, and Adolph Green has a job during the summers at a resort in the Poconos called Tamiment. Anybody ever hear of that? Okay. At Tamiment is a young dancer by the name of Jerome Robbins who does dancing and choreographs musical numbers there, and he wants to do greater things in ballet, and Adolph Green introduces Jerome Robbins to Leonard Bernstein, and Leonard Bernstein composes a ballet 11 minutes long called Fancy Free, about 3 sailors on a shore leave. They sit down and look at it and go, you know, this could maybe be a musical. And they go to the producer, director, writer, George Abbott. They present the idea to him. George Abbott goes to MGM, and before it's ever a Broadway musical, sells the idea to the movies. What Leonard Bernstein didn't know is his music didn't necessarily have to be used by MGM when it was filmed, and most of it was not. As a result, he never saw the movie ever. In the meantime, Leonard Bernstein, Comden and Green, and this is Comden and Green. They wrote music for themselves in this. This is Lenny Bernstein, and that's Jerome Robbins. And they wanted it to look like New York. It is the first multi-ethnic, multiracial musical done on purpose. You had Asian people, you had Latin people, you had everything you can imagine because New York looked like a melting pot. Now, once again, what did I tell you the theme of the musicals was? Right. This is about three guys on a shore leave. Now, who do you think was more sexually aggressive, the men or the women? It's the women. There's a song where he gets into a taxi cab and she sings to him, "Come on up to my place." And then she sings a second song, "Oh, and I can cook too." The women are far more sexually aggressive than these three sailors. And you also have to remember this was written during World War II. They didn't want it to have a sad ending, but they didn't exactly want it to be tied up in a neat little box with a bow. At the end of the day, these men get back on the ship, and who knows if they'll ever see each other again. And you get that feeling of melancholy, which was very much a part of the World War II era. But On the Town was groundbreaking because it had 9 choreographed ballet sections, which was very unusual for a musical at the time. After On the Town, we have Carousel. Now, there was a man by the name of Frederick Molnar who had written a play called Lilium in about 1911. It's a Hungarian play. Everybody was after Molnar to musicalize it. Puccini went to Molnar, and Molnar says, "No. If Puccini musicalizes my play into an opera, it'll be Puccini's Lilium, and Molnar will be forgotten." So by 1935, Molnar has come to the United States as well, fleeing the Nazis, and Kurt Weill is after him. There's several others who are after him. And finally, they take Molnar, the Theater Guild takes him, to see Oklahoma. And at the end of it, he says, "Well, if they could take that hideous play and turn it into this, imagine what they could do with my masterpiece." And Molnar allows Rodgers and Hammerstein to take Lilium and set it to music. And it becomes Carousel. They make some changes in it. They decide it should be set in the 1840s in the New England seaside, where the industrial era was truly a hideous time for many people. These women that worked in these factories had to live a very rigid, dour life. That Billy Bigelow, the barker from the Carousel, that they waited all year for this carousel to arrive in town because this was a high point. Now, there were sexual themes here as well. Billy Bigelow may have been having an affair with the woman who owned the carousel. Billy is there to entice younger women onto the carousel. And Carousel was very different in that it opened with a 9-minute ballet where you saw the way the story might play out. In addition to that, Carousel is referred to as the Hamlet of the musical. There are 2 things that happen in Carousel that had never happened before. The first is that Billy Bigelow, he's not the brightest guy. He's very frustrated. He's married Julie. He doesn't know why he's married her practically. And he feels very hemmed in. And he's hit her out of frustration. He doesn't know how to convey his emotions. And he finds out he's going to be a father. Rodgers and Hammerstein write an 8-minute musical soliloquy where first he starts talking about how wonderful it be to raise a son, my boy Bill. And then he says, but you know, what if he turns out to be a she, and a father has to be a daughter to a little girl, and he makes this fateful decision to commit a robbery to try to provide something for his daughter. It had never before been done in a musical. The other thing that happens in a musical, the song If I Loved You, is something called the bench scene. It is a 12-minute scene of dialogue and music that is interwoven where the song starts, and the song If I Loved You is really a mixture of all of that. And these 2 things really shaped Carousel. If any of you were going to be in New York in the spring, Renee Fleming is going to be in a revival of Carousel, and just to hear her sing You'll Never Walk Alone, I think will be worth the price of admission. But it's really pretty phenomenal, and it's the first revival of Carousel in something like 18 years on Broadway, and it's also going to star Jessie Mueller, who originated the part of Carole King in Beautiful. It's going to be quite special. So again, you know, this is everything I've already told you, that Billy Bigelow was basically an unlikable hero, about the soliloquy and so forth. Now, the woman who played, that's John Raitt, the woman who played Julie Jordan, I hope I'm talking to people who, well, does anybody know who Jan Clayton went on to be? Lassie's mother, good. So I'm only going to talk about this one for a minute because it's funny. Celeste Holm came to fame in a musical called Oklahoma playing Adu Annie. She gets cast in this musical called Bloomer Girl about women in the Civil War, and she's being approached by Hollywood to star in a movie that Elia Kazan is going to make called Gentleman's Agreement. She really wants to make it. She can't get out of her contract, and she's getting very, very frustrated because everybody tells her she'll win an Academy Award for the part, which she did, and she doesn't know what to do to get out of this. So what she does is she finally goes home, she reads her contract, which requires that she have long blonde hair. She went home that night, got red dye, cut her hair short, and showed up the next night on stage, and she got fired. She was replaced by Nanette Fabre, who actually wore a blonde wig. So it just shows you how people will play. So then, of course, Irving Berlin hadn't really been a force on the Broadway stage. He'd been much more involved in Hollywood. And during this period of time, Rodgers and Hammerstein were approached to write a musical based upon the life of Annie Oakley, and they really weren't quite sure that that was something they wanted to do. So they interested Jerome Kern in it, with lyrics to be done by Dorothy Fields. And they signed Merman onto this, and one Friday afternoon, Jerome Kern, as they start production, is walking down the street, has a severe stroke, and dies 2 days later. And they don't quite know what to do next. So what happens is they go to Irving Berlin, and Irving Berlin, quite honestly, isn't sure that this is something he can do. So he says, let me play with it over the weekend. He writes 6 songs immediately. They then, in the course of production, let me leave the pictures. I'll talk you through all this. It's hard to read anyway from where you're sitting. So during the course of production, the way musicals used to be done, they would go front to back on the stage, and you'd ultimately hit the back wall, and they'd have to close the curtain, and something would have to go on down here, and they'd go front to back on the stage. Again, they needed a number to be sung while something was going on. So they told this to Irving Berlin, and he goes home and he writes a song, and he comes in and says, look, guys, here it is. And there's a lot of versions of this, but I like this one the best. He said, guys, look, here's the deal. I wrote this really hideous song. If you want to keep it, but I threw out the other copy, and I'm leaving. I don't even want to know how you all feel about it because it stinks. The song goes like this. There's no business like show business. Then there's another thing that happened. They realized that they needed to have a song to show a competition between Annie and Frank. When they realized that, he says, let me go back to the office. He gets into the taxi cab, and in the 22 minutes it took him to get from the theater to his office, he wrote, anything you can do, I can do better. So he was a pretty lucky guy. And Ethel Merman now becomes Irving Berlin's chanteuse, so to speak. The next 2 musicals she does are with Irving Berlin. I'm just going to go by this slide quickly because I've told you all of it anyway. Kiss Me Kate. Cole Porter hadn't written anything in about 6 years, and they thought he was washed up. So he too decided to write a musical about sex, and he decides to use The Taming of the Shrew as the basis, and people wondered, would this even be interesting to the audiences? And Cole Porter got away with things that nobody else got away with. He wrote in double entendre and did things that were just, in the song Too Darn Hot, he has a lyric, a Marine with his queen. Well, nobody got what that meant then. But he wrote things, he really understood the Shakespeare, and it's the modern couple trying to stage this play, bickering backstage with the bickering that goes on between Petruchio and Kate. And he used the Shakespeare, I come to Ivad wealthily in Padua, or, that one just went out of my head, but then there was this one. He knew that Shakespeare used anachronisms. So he writes a song for Kate in the Taming of the Shrew part of, I hate men, I can't abide him even now and then. And there's a lyric, he may have hair upon his chest, but sister, so has Lassie. The business is the business that he gives his secretary. Oh, I hate men. That's what Cole Porter did. Kiss Me Kate became the most successful musical of Cole Porter's career. And about 5 years ago, the original cast recording of Kiss Me Kate was bestowed at the Library of Congress as being iconic of its era. And they name one recording a year of a time to get that accolade, and Kiss Me Kate achieved it. The Tony Award was created in 1947. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. Finian's Rainbow the next year is a fantasy that for the first time, or for not the first time, Showboat being the first, but starts to use racism as a plot device. But I want to get to the granddaddy of all of that. And I'm going to go by Brigadoon very quickly as well, I believe. And I'm not going to mention that in any detail right now just because of time. And then what we're going to do is talk about the biggie. Oh, I have to talk about her first. Anita Loos had a book, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Does anybody know who was supposed to star in it? Betty Grable. And she wanted to keep an eye on her husband, Harry James, so she opted out. And they found this odd person, Carol Channing, and if I were to play the recording feud right now, you too would wonder how anybody ever could imagine Carol Channing not seeing her on stage. But she launches Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and then we get to the granddaddy of all of them. Rodgers and Hammerstein had a flop called Allegro. And they were looking for the next thing that they wanted to do. So they go, you know, so many things happen, not because they make sense, but just because of what happens. And James Michener lived in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, and Oscar Hammerstein lives in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. James Michener has written a collection of short stories called Tales of the South Pacific. He and Richard Rodgers read them, and they decide that the 19th short story, it's a collection of 19 short stories, is a story about a young man who was a student at Princeton, enlists in the Marines, gets sent to an island in the South Pacific, has a torrid love affair with a young girl, gets her pregnant, goes off to battle, and gets killed. As they start to write this, they think, oh my gosh, we are writing another version of Madame Butterfly. At that point in time, Ezio Pinza's agent, Ezio Pinza being under contract at the Met, was very, very unhappy with his relationship there and is looking for something to do, and his agent reaches out and says, you know, my client is looking for a project. And they go back to the short stories very, very quickly, and they realize that short story number 8 or 9, whatever, is a story about a French planter who's very wealthy, who fled France as a young man because he thought he was going to falsely be accused of murder. He arrives on this island, fathers 11 illegitimate children. And they go, well, maybe there's something there we can work with. It certainly won't be 11 illegitimate children, but, you know, we can work with that. Then there's another story about a young woman from Arkansas who wants to go to the war effort. And as they like to write to formula, they like to have an A couple and a B couple, so they go back to story number 19. But they also like to have a matriarchal figure, and there's a story about a woman who's willing to sell her daughter to the highest bidder. That becomes Bloody Mary. The daughter becomes the girl that has the affair with Lieutenant Cable, and they need comic relief. And there's another story about a man who wants to go to a boar's tooth ceremony on another island. That becomes Luther Billis, and now you have the characters that are rounded out for South Pacific. Now, I know it's a little hard to see, but this picture, the one on the bottom left, is actually Mary Martin singing with Ezio Pinza. It never happens because Mary Martin's husband was afraid they wouldn't hear Mary if she sang with him, so it's written into her contract she could have no duets. Ezio Pinza, not to be outdone, decides he only wants to sing 15 minutes worth of music in South Pacific, so it is written to be, at tempo, 14 minutes and 30 seconds. That's kind of what happens. Then there's another scandal. See, that's the fake picture. That never happens. But this next picture is also a scandal. How are you going to tell an audience in 1949 that white-bread Lieutenant Cable had a torrid affair or did something with this native girl? Because now today you'd see it on stage. It would be no big deal. But then, boy, they had to figure this out. So what they decided is when Lieutenant Cable sings Younger Than Springtime to Liat, he must have his shirt off. This was considered scandalous in 1949. So as they're getting ready to produce South Pacific, and they're in New Haven trying it out, the show is running pretty close to 4 hours, and the producers who were involved with Rodgers and Hammerstein are getting very, very upset that they think that all of the goodwill that is been provided up to this point will now be thrown away because of one particular song. And Rodgers and Hammerstein decide that if, in fact, this song is cut, there will be no South Pacific. They're adamant about it. This is the song. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8. To hate all the people your relatives hate, you've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught. Thank you. That song won South Pacific the Pulitzer Prize. Are a lot of you U.S. American people? Okay. I want you to know, because it's a trivia question. Who played Mary Martin's understudy in South Pacific? Cloris Leachman. What famous Scottish actor was in the chorus of South Pacific in England because the boys in the chorus were all too not man enough, so they needed a couple macho guys? Yes, Sean Connery. Good. You all knew that. I want to thank you all. I'm going to be every day at 11 o'clock. As I understand it now, we'll be here. And I'm going to give you a historical overview coming up to the modern time. The day we get to New York, I'm doing a really cool lecture, how New York is a theme in the backdrop of the Broadway musical. And I'll be talking all the way to Miami. One other thing. On the last cruise, because I was here the week before, I brought books with me. I couldn't believe how many I sold. There are still some in the liquor shop. If anybody's interested, you can get them. It's free. It just goes on your C card. And if I sell out of them quickly, what I'm going to try to do is have some sent to me in Boston for you. But anybody that gets them now, I'll be very happy to autograph them. My grandchildren are still trying to figure out how I was smart enough to write a book. But in any event. Does anybody have any questions you'd like to ask before we leave? Oh, it's called the Ultimate Broadway Musical List Book, and I put Broadway musicals into all kinds of categories that you can argue with me about. So, anybody have anything else you'd like to know? Thank you. Why what? The reason there are no film clips, in this era, most of the Broadway musicals were not captured in any way, shape, and form. And the question was, why are there no film clips? And she loves the fact that I'm singing. What I decided was my novelty piece was that I can do that. And I will sing in part of every single lecture. And it goes back to a story where years ago, my wife and I were in Venice, and there was a guy in the back of the gondola singing songs. So I turned to my wife, I said, I'm not going to row this thing, but I can stand in the back and sing. And I never dreamt I'd get to sing on a ship. So that's how it came about. Thank you. Does anybody have anything else? Yes. The question is it customary to be revivals? Now, do you all have 15 to 20 million you want to use? Well, if you're a producer and you're going to spend 15 to 20 million dollars, you want to hope that people are going to come see this. So revivals are about a fourth of everything that gets produced right now. If anybody has tickets in some point in time to see Bette Midler do Hello Dolly, it's incredible. But if you don't get to see Bette, Bernadette Peters is going to be even better. I've seen Bette Midler 4 times. I know I'm not supposed to say that to anybody. I take theater trips from Washington to New York all the time, and I've taken several groups to see Bette Midler, and it is so well directed because she does the same thing every single performance. It's incredible. But you know, you want to have an insurance policy that if I'm going to invest this kind of money, people are going to come see it. And you know, it's a wonderful thing because my fear was that the only Broadway musicals my grandchildren would ever see would have Disney in its title. And I love taking them to see these things that they never would have seen. And they're done the right way. I mean, there's a lot of really great, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Anybody have anything else you want to know? Yeah. I guess it's someone know where I got my singing talent. It's in the gene pool, I think, actually. But when I was young, I was about 14 years old, and I started playing the piano when I was 5. And I was in a junior high school chorus, and the chorus teacher said to me, "Would you like to sing a duet of White Christmas at our Christmas concert? You need to go home and ask your mom and dad." And they said yes. And they called my mom and dad, and my parents said sure. And they told my parents, "I think he has an instrument there, you need to do something." Now, I live in Washington, D.C., and at that point in time, there was the very prominent vocal teacher, Todd Duncan, who was the original Porgy and Bess. Lived in Washington and taught, and I'm an only child. So my mother, this is 1965. So my mother decides I always had to have the very best. She calls Todd Duncan and says, "I have a child prodigy and he needs to meet with you." And he says, "Well, that's absolutely fine. I'll see your prodigy, but it's $35 an hour." At which point she said, "Who else can you send me to?" So I studied with a student of Todd Duncan's for 20 years. And when I went to college, I was not a voice major. I was not an entertainment major of any sort. And I went to the head of the voice department, and he said, "You're really pretty gifted. I want you to study with me." And this was my hobby. You know, I've just done this my whole life. And one of my most recent voice teachers was a Metropolitan Opera diva. And I studied at Carnegie Mellon, and I used to go study with these people, and they all used to make me crazy. "Steve, you don't sing enough, you don't sing enough, you don't sing enough." Well, I have a problem. I hate rehearsals. And I did do some choir singing, and one of the things I'm most proud of, vocally, when I turned 50, my 2 sons married people who, my younger son's a drama teacher, and he performs and owns a theater in California. My older son has won national acting awards. My wife and I used to sing together. And on my 50th birthday, my 25th anniversary, we did a concert for 250 people where we all did it together. It was a really special moment. And I've done 2 professional recordings with my kids. And another neat thing was about 30 years ago, I did 2 major concerts in Boston, and I couldn't believe anybody would pay to come hear me sing. I don't know, it's my thing. And I just never wanted to make a living doing it, but I love doing this more than anything. And I teach in 15 venues in the Washington, D.C. area for senior learning. And it's just the greatest thing on earth. The people that I've met, because I get to do this, it's just really kind of incredible. So thank you for asking. Yeah, another question. No, I mean, I've learned every style of music. I mean, I've learned opera, and one of the things that most teachers will tell you is you need to learn the things you might not want to sing because it does things for your voice. So, I mean, I could bore you all and sing Italian arias all day long, but it's not my favorite thing to do. I'm really a musical theater guy. I love Stephen Sondheim like you cannot believe. And oh, isn't that incredible? I saw it last week, too. Follies, it was spectacular. If you're in London again, you can get tickets, get them. Follies was absolutely amazing. It was the best production of Follies ever, ever, ever. Anyway, I'm a Sondheim guy. I never sang "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning" until I started doing these lectures, and I figured out how much I really love that song. It's just spectacular. So I'm just a student of the Broadway musical, period. Anybody have anything else you want to know? Yes. No. Thank you for asking that. The modern technology age has made this possible because I can't bring, well, if my wife's with me when she's not this week, she was last week, I can't bring somebody to share my cabin to play the piano. I cannot play the piano and sing. And one of the things, there is a gentleman in Los Angeles who you send him the music and he does it for you any way that you want. There's also something called the London Vocal Academy, and when I was on the cruise last week, there was a woman whose daughter actually teaches there. They have phenomenal accompaniments, and you just have to accept that you're singing to tracks. It's not, you have to kind of get very close to the track, but it works for this kind of a thing. And I've even, I recently did a concert last week called famous Broadway musicals and their love songs, and I did it all to tracks. It's just the way it is, but it works. Thank you for asking. Where is Showboat? Who asked me? Okay, who was Showboat what? 1927, it was the first. I'm going to talk about Showboat in another lecture I'm doing called Show Business and Its Influence on the Musical. Yes. Yes. Correct. No, the question was Allie Hackham in Oklahoma sings. There were a lot of character songs that were spoken somewhat. And when I talk about The King and I next time, we'll talk about spoken singing quite a bit. Thank you for asking that. If you want to talk to me, let me pack up and I'll meet you up there in the back because they need us out of here. And my book is in the liquor store if anybody wants to do that. And thank you all for being here. I hope I'll see you all tomorrow. Tell your friends, Thank you all.